Hey folks, Steve here with another World in Flames video, another episode in our War in Europe series. We've completed in previous videos the general organization of the game. We've gotten the administrative counters set down, we organized our force pools, and we started to do setup for most of the major powers, and that is mostly complete. Now, first thing I'll note here is you look at the map. French might be a little hard to see with the lighting over there. There's not a whole lot of units on the map. There's a whole lot of empty space. And the front lines haven't really developed, right, yet, because we haven't started playing. One thing I'd just let you know that, things will get busier once the powers are actually at war and they call out their reserves. The reserves are basically free units that you can place. They start in home country cities, flipped, so you can't really do anything with them. They sort of come on, and then you're either going to reorg them, which you probably won't be doing because your HQs that could flip them back are going to be busy on the front lines, but they'll flip at the end of a turn, and then they'll be useful. So you get them for free, but they take time to enter the fray. But that's going to bring a lot of units on the board for free of the major powers like France, like even Germany is going to get some, and Russia will get a whole bunch. Especially if the Germans are at war with them. So we completed the setups, the general setups for everybody but Germany. The last video, you can review that if you'd like. I think I've set them up somewhat competently. There's a lot of different ways to look at it. We made some strategic decisions as the Commonwealth as to how we were going to have our convoy lines set up and how we were getting our resources. We opted for more risk, for more production. And that might come back to bite us, but we'll see. And now comes the time to set up the final faction of the game, and that is Germany. And of course, Germany is sort of the principal driver of the early game, and really is probably the most important to set up as the Axis. Italy has, some importance, but, really... it's Germany that has the greatest impact of the game, right? This should be obvious, right, if you're familiar with World War II. Now, something that I want to talk about before we do the actual setup, I've done a little bit. I put the German Navy up here, and I put a convoy out, but I haven't put any of the ground units, like the infantry and the mech and the armor and the planes yet, because as the German player, you kind of have to decide what is your strategy going to be. And obviously, you can change strategy mid-game, call an audible, and switch things up. But again, you want to be as efficient as possible, and you kind of want to have your game plan determined. And that setup is really going to govern how and what you want to do. Now, when I've looked at the game and I've been trying to figure out what my strategy was going to be, I've been very reliant on, this timeline I made, I showed in the last video, that is more or less a historical game plan, or the historical timeline, which, as we look here for the Axis powers, we want to conquer Poland. We want to do that by October 39. We need to invade Denmark and Norway, which occurred in April through June 40. We want to invade the Low Countries and France during the summer of 40, if not sooner if we can get going. Italy joined the war in June 40. We'll have to decide when and how we want Italy to do that. If we wait too long, we provide the Commonwealth the capability to kind of build up Gibraltar, Malta, and Egypt. So it's kind of important. I made a big mistake in an in-person game that I'm playing with friends where I had Italy join much later, and it was probably a mistake for me to do that. So I need to think about Italy joining earlier. There was an invasion of Greece in late 40. Hungary and Romania joined the Axis powers late 40. Bulgaria joined up in 41. The Deutsche Afrika Corps was sent to North Africa in early 41-ish. There was an invasion of Yugoslavia not long after that, and sort of delayed or had an impact on getting ready for Barbarossa, the invasion of USSR in June 1941, where we also would align Finland at that point, very likely. And then some of these other actions, which are really kind of in reaction to what the Allies would do, we might collapse Vichy. We'll get to talking about that, and basically support Italy through 43, when Italy will, unfortunately, I'm sure, suffer an Allied invasion that will knock their government out of sorts. And there are some special rules around how Italy surrenders. France has the Vichy rules, which are pretty significant and nuanced, and we'll take a look at that when the time comes. But basically, if we want to be on schedule, in fact, we probably want to be ahead of schedule where possible, we have to think as Germany how we're going to get to and do all of those things. Now, for the most part, that timeline kind of stretches us out to the war with the Soviet Union. So assuming we do all the early stuff in a decent timeline, we can look at the war against Russia. That's really going to be sort of one of the big shows. And depending on how that war goes, we'll decide everything else, right? If we somehow manage to do very well against the Soviets, then we're looking in a great game position where we might even call it and just say the Axis will win the game. Or the historical thing will happen where the Axis starts getting pushed back and we play through the rest. And from there, the Axis is really reacting to the timeline the Allies are setting for themselves, invading North Africa, invading Italy, taking out Germany, doing a D-Day landing, and so on and so forth. So the breakdown there is, the very first thing that we're going to end up having is the invasion of Poland here. So when we go to set up our land units, we're probably going to set up heavily against the Polish in the east. However, after we've declared war on Poland, and we're not going to knock them out in one impulse, it's just pretty much impossible, the French and the Commonwealth will declare war on Germany, and we're going to need some guys along these 4 hexes just to defend against the French. Even though it's unlikely the French will try anything, we can't just leave it empty. So we're going to have to take some of our guys, we're going to have to place them over on the West Front, and just sort of have a lined up set of guys for the eventual invasion of the West Front when that occurs. So there's going to be some balancing, right? We need some guys over here to hold. We're going to have the majority of our offensive capability in the east ready to hit Poland. Now, there are other things that we need to consider. So if we look at the schedule, the next thing is Denmark and Norway, which would be done sort of in the early phases of 1940. And this is where, strategy starts to come in and what you want to do. Because you don't have to do the historical path. So while I think for this playthrough, for this series of the war in Europe, I'm probably, just for the sake of ease, going to follow a pretty historical trajectory, the basic strategy of, do all those historical things and hope that the war against the USSR goes very well. And if we do at least reasonably well, that we can hold enough objective cities, then the Germans can call that a victory by the end of the game in 45. But there are other options, and there are different things that you would do to support those other options. So, and most of these really come into play after the first few phases of the game, usually up to taking out France. So that's sort of your pivot point. There's really 3 major grand strategy paths for the Axis, and this has come from discussion online. I think this is noted in the player notes of the campaign book. At least from a European perspective, the Axis can do the historical path, right? The one that I'm going to try to play through. The other options are, after taking out France, do you pivot and try Sea Lion? That's one of the paths, right? And you have to do all of your production builds in alignment with making that succeed. So you have to decide that not after you've conquered France. You have to decide that very early. You have to say, okay, I'm going to start building more amphibious landing craft. I'm going to build more planes to help provide air cover. You need to start planning for that from the very first turn of the game. And if you decide not to do a sea lion, you could still make use of those things that you built otherwise, but you have to make that commitment. And it's very likely that your allied opponents will see you building those things, and they may sort of prepare for that potential pivot. But that's one of the things you're going to decide to do, right? You're going to go, take out Poland, do potentially, if you want to spend the time doing it, Denmark and Norway, and then into France, and pivot from France to a sea lion and naval invasion of the Commonwealth. And the thinking there is that if the Axis powers are able to invade the UK, and either conquer it or basically make it non-operational for the Allies. That's going to shift the game in pretty major ways, right? France is knocked out, and then Britain will be effectively knocked out, right? You're going to have taken or knocked out most of their factory capability. Whatever is out there in India, Australia, and Canada will be, pennies compared to what the UK would be producing. And so you've knocked out a lot of the Allied production capability. Then by controlling the island, you have the ability to disrupt shipping over this general area, so the Murmansk convoy's at risk, all of that. And then if the U.S. enters the war and they're going to try to get into Europe, they're going to have to land somewhere. They're going to go somewhere first, and they're not going to be able to use the UK as a staging point for D-Day, right? I mean, they might try to go for North Africa directly, and there's going to be some challenges with that. They might have to invade Ireland or the UK itself, but that's very different than the typical D-Day where the US can have a bunch of units here in the UK, they can have a bunch of air power and naval units stationed there to prepare for the invasion. Instead, they're going to be attempting to navigate an invasion from the US itself, or maybe a hop over like Greenland or Iceland or something to try to get over, and they'll have to do an invasion of the UK and then an invasion of France or one or the other, and there's just a lot of dangers tied up in doing that. And so some people will look at that and say, well, if the Axis can successfully do sea line and knock the UK out, that's kind of game decided, because everything else, the Western Allies are basically shut down, shut out of Europe, and with the Germans' ability to kind of refocus on Russia, even if it's a late Russia invasion, like 42 or something, by that point, they don't have to worry about strategic bombing over in the factory areas of Germany. They have less production they have to spend over here. They can spend it all dealing with Russia at that point. And even if they don't knock Russia out, which would be unlikely, they basically have enough of a holding position, enough of a delay for the Allies that they'll end the game in 45 with enough objectives to say they've won the game. So some folks will say you call the game if that happened. You say, yeah, the Axis did it. They did the impossible, and we'll call the game there. Because there's maybe not much use with playing further. An Allied player might say, no, let's give it a try, but you have to decide that. The third option, besides those two, is to close the Med. So this kind of assumes that instead of going north after taking out France, you've either gotten really lucky with some sort of naval invasion of Gibraltar, which is very, very difficult, or the Germans have simply pushed through France and have invaded Spain and knocked out Spain and taken Gibraltar that way. And it's certainly, you're having to deal with a whole other country to invade right away, and that can be a bit of a challenge. But the idea is you shut down Gibraltar. That enables you to kind of have control through the Western Med, and then you focus those similar forces, you focus your operational ability on shutting down Egypt as well, and then potentially going for the oil in Iraq and so on, so that you're making the Mediterranean an Axis lake, and now you can kind of clear the way in Europe essentially, and by doing that you've kind of hurt the Allies' ability to ship resources. So they have to react to that. And you can kind of, you don't have distractions for the Italians anymore. You have access to resources better, and then you're doing probably a 42 Barbarossa, and again similarly you have one front you don't have to worry about as much, and you can make use of your resources to kind of push into Russia that way. And I'm not sure how well that compares to the other strategies. I've not done that myself, so it's hard to say. So for the sake of this video series, I am just doing the standard, but if you're going to do any of those other options, you kind of have to be thinking about what you want to build ahead of time, because everything takes multiple turns to build. You want to get started right away. You need to start making that decision. For me, with going with the standard, then I'm going to want to make sure that I still want to build plenty of air. I'm going to be focused on ground units, and I won't be as worried about trying to invade the UK or pushing into Egypt. I might still, obviously send some forces to help the Italians as Germany later and help them try to push back into Egypt. But, we'll have to see how it all plays out, right? That's going to be part of the game. So this is kind of a long intro on grand strategy, but I think I needed to talk to it so that you understand the next portion of the video, where I'm going to be talking about just how we're going to go about invading these minor countries in the early phases of the game. So I'm going to put a cut here, and when we come back, we'll talk to that. Okay, so here are the pools I had for all of the German ground units. So you can see we have a whole bunch of regular infantry there, sort of in the bottom row, and then we have HQs, we have 2 armor units, we have a mechanized unit, we have some motorized, some garrisons, a mountain unit, 4 fighters of 2 build time, a fighter of 3 build time, land bombers, naval bomber, and an air transport. And so when I have drawn these, right, and I'm looking at setup, you're the German player, something I was hoping to get but I did not get was a 5 movement motorized infantry. Now, why do I want a 5 movement infantry as opposed to something else? Well, it comes down to deciding, do I do an early invasion of Denmark and thus try to then do an early... Okay, so adjust the camera so we could see this. So doing an early Denmark and Norway invasion campaign, and by early I mean like 1939 early, requires a couple of things if we want to do it as fast as possible. So Denmark doesn't actually start with any units. The only unit that it can get is a reserve, which it will call out if it can survive for 1 impulse of German attack. So what you need to do is have a unit that can get from a starting position in Germany, like this hex, and get it to Copenhagen, which is the capital. And if you can take the capital, you will have basically conquered Denmark, the one and done, as it were. So you need to be able to get over there. Now, you might want to do this towards like the end of a turn, so you can just snatch it before the end comes up and just conquer it that way. But what you actually need to do to get over there takes a certain number of movement points. And of course, all of this is going to be governed by the weather. So if this is rainy weather or wintry weather, you may not be able to get there. But straits, which is an important piece of the puzzle here, cost extra to go across. So it's 1 extra movement point. And there are straits here. So if we were moving a unit, we would go 1, 2, 3, 4, it looks like. So yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4. So actually, I guess we could do it with one of our motorized units here. So if we placed one of our starting motorized right here, we could do 1, 2, 3, 1 for the clear and +1 for the straights, and then another one into Copenhagen. Now we would need to, again, if there's any weather issues at all, then our ability to do that in one fell swoop is nil. But we can probably decide that midstream, right? We say, hey, weather's clear, we're good to go, let's take out Denmark. Once we're able to do that, then we can start looking at hitting Norway. And Norway is going to be relying on the capture of Oslo, which is not necessarily going to be super duper easy to capture. But we will have the ability to get over there and capture them either via paratrooper or a regular invasion. And so in order to do that, we're going to want to have air cover. We're going to want to invade. I think we actually end up having to invade one of these hexes first and then walk over because you can only invade a hex if it has an all-sea hex side. Which means we can't invade Oslo directly. if I'm remembering right. I'll double check when the time comes. So, we're going to want to hit them with air, so we need to be able to base out of like Frederikshavn to count 1, 2, 3, 4 hexes to bomb Oslo for ground support. So trying to take Norway without Denmark is more difficult. We need to go through Denmark and then have ourselves set up for Norway. So how would you do that? Well, if you want to do it as fast as possible, again, we've got to have that motorized unit there ready to move swiftly into Denmark. We could potentially use a different, relatively fast-moving infantry, since it doesn't look like we need more than that in this particular case. But then, the other thing is we are going to want to have our air power located nearby to rebase up there. We're going to want to have our amphibious landing craft available to take a different, likely a different infantry unit from Germany, like in Kiel, and make it up to the coast of Norway and go from there. And so all of that, is really going to be, the invasion of Norway is a great sort of beginner's guide to how to do combined arms warfare of, getting your infantry, getting them into an area across water using invasion capability, and striking a target from far away with air. It's a really nice encapsulated example of performing operations like that where the U.S. and Japan are going to need to know how to do that in their theaters or when they're operating, and this is, again, a nice way to interact with it. So if we were going to set up for an early Denmark and Norway invasion, then we would want to be setting up for that like this, and so we'd probably put, see, we have a relatively long-range bomber, so we'd want it nearby so that we could then rebase it up here when the time came. We would want to make sure that amongst our guys in Kiel, we would have another force to do an invasion, and we'd have to decide how strong out of our available infantry do we want to send. If we look at what I have here of regular infantry, we've got some 7th strength ones, we've got some 5 strength, so there's weaker and stronger ones. There's even a weak 4 strength unit, but those 7.3s are probably awesome, would be great to use. But the pros and cons to all of this is that, basically, if whatever we use for one of these early invasions we're not using in our invasion of Poland, and we might need it, we might think we can just crush the Polish, but there is going to be die rolls involved. We could get some bad die rolls. So what kind of gamble do we want to make here? We've got to, if we're going to do it all at the same time, we definitely need to have it prepped the right way to succeed. Now, I'll point out on the very first impulse of the game, we can't declare war on Denmark or Norway, because we're reduced to only declaring war on Poland. So this would be a second axis impulse decision. If we were going to do it at the same time as Poland, we could finish up Poland and do it maybe in October, November, or December of 39. But the weather would be against us in that case, and we'd have to figure out, is it worthwhile for that? Now, there's one other consideration to all of this. And I guess I'm gonna put a cut here and get the camera set up to talk about the other consideration as to why we wouldn't do an early invasion of Denmark and Norway. Because again, the option's there, we have the ability to do it, but why wouldn't we, besides the additional logistical strain? We'll talk to that in just a second. Okay, camera's set up and stable. So, like I was mentioning, the decision of doing these early invasions of these different countries, certainly seems like an appetizing choice, right? You say, well, if the rules aren't keeping us from attacking Denmark and Norway early, and we think we can do it, well, why not try, right? Get ahead of that timeline that we mentioned earlier. Well, there's one other consideration to this, and this wraps back to U.S. entry, which again is a complex mechanic, not one that is always easily understood by newbies, and I'll even admit, I think there's nuances to the mechanics that I don't always appreciate. So the risk of doing these early invasions, meaning early being 39, is that the U.S. entry impact is a little bit different if you do it in 39 versus 1940. So, besides the benefit of having less logistical strain and having a more focused effort, if you wait to do Denmark and Norway, is that if you do Denmark and Norway in 1940, ideally early 1940, you will very likely, though it comes down to a little bit of luck and in terms of what you're pulling and what the odds are, you have a better chance of not accruing as much U.S. entry markers. So basically invading in 39 is more likely to get the U.S. into the war earlier than later, essentially. And so, or at least giving them more ammunition to enact the U.S. entry events that can help the Allies more, right? Because that's the other piece of it. It's not just the U.S. is entering the war, it's the more U.S. entry they have, the more options they can take that can allow them to provide resources to the Allies earlier or increase their production multiplier. So the more you can suppress the U.S. entry gain, the better off you might be as the Axis. So to understand this, I did some sort of very basic statistical analysis of the U.S. entry chits. Now, we talked about them in the other video. Basically, they're the U.S. flag counters, and there are some for 39, 40, 41, 42, and 43. And those counters are set up that way because each year, when the factions all get more units to add to their force pools, you update the pool, the cup of counters to draw from for U.S. entry. And those counters have different ranges of values. There's a 0 chit. It can go as high as 7. But where those chits are, and basically the ratio of chits, is different from year to year. Now, to help illustrate this, I printed off a spreadsheet of the analysis I did. So there's 39 chits, there's 40 chits, 41, 42, 43. The largest number of chits comes from 39, so there's sort of like a baseline that gets included. And then, obviously, some of these chits are being pulled out as certain entry events are happening, and so as the 39 pool gets smaller, you'll eventually get into 40, where these are added, and then these are added, these are added, these are added. Now, the only troubling thing with this analysis is that it can't account for what you're pulling out. You can do that live in the spreadsheet, right? That wouldn't be hard to do. But if you were trying to figure out, okay, well, what did the U.S. player draw? What's left? What are the odds? That all is going to be in the ether. That's what you're going to be guessing and hedging your bets on in terms of risk on what you're deciding to do or not do in the game. But basically, if you look here, the average value on a chit that you pulled from 1939 is 2.39 repeating. So a little over 2. So if you're pulling a chit for 1939, it is likely to be, on average, 2, you could look at it being potentially 3, because out of all the chits that are available, there's quite a bit of 1s, there's a lot of 2s, there's a fair number of 3s, there's even some 4s, and I forgot to add the 2 that I already pulled, so I had to add them at the end, but a 5 and a 1 and another 1 and a 3. Now, if you looked at the 1940 chits in a vacuum, right, there's a 0, there's a bunch of 1s, there's a couple 2s and a 3. Their average is 1.2 repeating, which is quite a bit less. The next year, 43 in a vacuum is 3.4, which is quite a bit more. 4.1, quite a bit more. 4.9, whoops, quite a bit more in 43. What actually matters is the composite average. So this is, if you're adding all the chits together over time, how would that average change? Well, 39 by itself is a 2.39. Once you add in the 40 chits, the average drops down to 1.8. Now, obviously, this average would change in your actual game, because if you pulled in 39 a low chit for something, and then the remaining average is going to go up because you took out a low value chit. But just in terms of illustrating the example here, you add in the 40 chits, the average will go down. Once you get to 41, the average starts to get back up, and then 42, it goes up again, and by 43, it goes up again, where the consistency of what kind of chits you're pulling for U.S. entry is going to be higher over time. But oddly, the sort of reverse of that trend is 40, where it goes down. And this is sort of, I think it's implemented this way to kind of help provide an incentive for the Axis to do the 40 invasions and to not do these early actions. That you can do them early, but there's a cost, and that's the U.S. entry. The historical path has you wait a little bit, and the benefit to waiting is the reduced U.S. entry chance, or the net effect being it's more likely you're going to pull a lower chit than a higher chit for U.S. entry, which is the benefit. So in some ways, it's sort of you're looking at it sort of like you can't do too much in 39, right? You're not going to go maybe 2 balls to the wall in 39. You're going to take out Poland, and then you're going to let things kind of chill for a few months, and then in 40 you're going to see a spike in activity, and that happens again to be the best year for U.S. entry for the Axis, because again that average is lower. If you're going to do stuff, it's going to be 40, and obviously things start to come back up in 41. So if you're going to do, you want to invade Greece, historically that was sort of fall, almost winter of 40, and you're getting that benefit. If you were going to try to do an early takeout of Yugoslavia, and you think you could do it in 40, 40 might be a better time than 41, because of, again, once it's 41, that average starts to increase again, and you're more likely to draw higher level chits for U.S. entry. So I hope I'm explaining that well. I hope that makes sense, right? If you think about it in terms of political impact, doing too much activity would be bad, and the U.S. is going to pay too much attention. If you're sort of dragging it out a little bit, and these major events are happening farther apart, or at least in a potential lull in the action for 40, there's some benefit to that. I don't know if I'm explaining it right or if the metaphor is right, but that is why we would not choose to invade Denmark and Norway, is that it's going to be too much cost for the U.S. entry. Let's focus all of our forces, or the majority of our offensive capability, on Poland. We'll put a couple of things in place for the Denmark and Norwegian invasions, but they can wait a little bit. We can spend a few turns repositioning our forces, building new forces, and start to look at the execution of that if we get a nice spring and the weather permits us to knock things out. That would be the ideal situation potentially for us. Now, there is one other element that further complicates this decision, and I know it's ridiculous, right? We're talking about so many things, but World War II was complicated, and there is yet one more thing to be thinking about, and this relates to Norway and a decision on the part of the Commonwealth. We'll take a pause here so I can catch my breath and think through what I want to say, and we'll be back with that point. Okay, so let's talk to the final aspect that might make you decide whether or not an early invasion of Norway is worth it. So, there are a number of special actions that can be taken, and again, this is going to be something that you would really appreciate by reading through all the rules, and I know that takes some time to really absorb, but I'll help by pointing out the pages that matter. If you look at the print rulebook on page 45, this is going to be the section right before right before 13.4 for return to base, and before you start talking about aircraft and stuff, is the U.S. entry section of the rulebook. There are certain actions that are called out with more detail on what does it mean, and so if you're going to take a certain action in the game, that's going to have an effect on U.S. entry a certain way. Well, one of the really important ones that needs to be appreciated is number 39, mining of the Norwegian coast. So once per game, provided the USA and Norway are both neutral and Paris is Allied controlled, meaning the Allies have to do this before the fall of France. Then at the start of any Commonwealth naval action, the Commonwealth may turn face down, any face up, basically saying I'm going to use this unit, surface capital ship in the fore section of the Norwegian Sea area. This does not count as a naval move or combat, and announce that they are mining the Norwegian coast. So at some point, the Commonwealth is going to take some of their ships. They're going to come out to the Norwegian Sea, right? They're going to go up to the Norwegian Sea. They're going to be in the forebox, so it's going to be, they're going to leave from Scapa Flow. They're going to head up there. They're going to get in the forebox, and then on their next naval action, well, I guess, at the start, so they would have already have moved out there, and then on the next impulse, the Commonwealth would execute this. So you could see it being telegraphed, right, as the axis. If the Commonwealth moves ships out there and puts them up in the Norwegian Sea in the forebox, you can probably guess, hey, probably next impulse they're going to try to mine the coast, right? And if that is what, if you see that happen and you have an opportunity to respond and you've got your invasion of Norway lined up, maybe that's when you execute it. But here is what happens when you do the action. So then they roll a die, and based on the range of the die, regardless of the roll, the Norwegian coast is mined. From now on, if the last impulse of any turn is blizzard or snow in the Arctic weather zone, Germany may only ship Swedish resources through the Baltic Sea that turn if Oslo is Axis-controlled or there are equal to or more face-up Axis ships in the North Sea than Allied, which is unlikely. And the designer note is this represents that the iron ore transported through neutral Norwegian waters during winter would cease given a heavy British naval presence unless German minesweeping was given a substantial escort. And so here on the die roll, it's like, well, if the die roll is high, which is not what the Commonwealth wants, Norway could simply become German aligned without having to be invaded, which would be great for the Axis. And some of these other aspects, basically it's steering Norway into your sphere of influence, and potentially the Commonwealth, if they're really lucky here, are going to get some free convoys from the Norwegians and all this other stuff, right? So it's sort of, good and bad. If the die roll goes poorly for the Commonwealth, then you get a free ally in Norway as the Axis. But there's a modifier to the die roll where if the Commonwealth uses one of their aircraft carriers, they get a -1 of the die roll. So they kind of keep that from being possible if they're paying attention. And that sort of forces something, right? So if the die roll goes a certain way, they mine the waters, and Norway would have to be invaded in order to avoid the penalty, which is through winter most of the time, the Germans are going to miss a resource that they're getting from Sweden. Now, the way to resolve that, right, is that you invade Oslo, you take Oslo, and then you're good to go. You have the ability to get the resource. So it sort of puts you in the position of, well, if you're going to invade Norway anyway, you can take Norway, and then mining the Norwegian coast, if the Commonwealth hasn't done it, then there's not much point in doing it now, because you've taken Norway. But the Commonwealth can use that as a threat, and they can put it into effect. They have the option to, basically at their leisure, to try it. And again, this, there's no perfect answer to this. There's not like here's the best thing to do in the situation. I think it just comes down to, is the Commonwealth going to try to do it to disrupt the Germans, and are the Germans already deciding to invade Norway anyway? And taking this action may simply push that timetable. So if the Commonwealth does it early, and they manage to get a good die roll, then that might force the German player to open up Oslo earlier, invade Norway earlier than they had planned, because otherwise they might miss out on the resource that can't be transported through the Baltic in the winter anymore. So just something to be thinking about and how you want to deal with that. I think for my purposes, I might just do the historical thing, and we'll see how it all plays out and what the Commonwealth decides to do. But all of those things are sort of decisions that, as Germany, you need to be thinking about in the early game, right? Are you going to bother to set up all of your forces on Poland? Are you going to go for early Denmark and Norway? Do you think the reasons and the pressure to do that are, more important than the U.S. entry impacts? Are you even going to do something really squirrely and set up, a dual invasion of Poland and the Netherlands all in 39? You could try that, right? You could start early on the Low Countries. There are, issues with that. Again, U.S. entry, and you're splitting your forces, but that's an option. You might even be thinking, well, as soon as I'm done with Poland, I want to try to take on the Soviet Union and do a 1940 Barbarossa. That's an option too, but you've got to figure out how you're going to do it. And the sooner you decide what your game plan is, the sooner you can prep your setup and your production to reinforce that. Now, with all of that said, this was a lot of talking without a lot of placement. I'm going to do my setup here off camera, and when we come back, I'll show you what I ultimately have decided to do. I won't say it'll be a perfect setup, but it will reinforce what I'm going to try to do in my game. But if you're playing at home, you're thinking about playing online with buddies via Vassal or something, those are the considerations I would be thinking about. What's your long-term game plan? What's on your checklist, and what's your strategy going to be? And make sure that your setup reinforces that, and that your plan builds for the first few turns are in alignment with that strategy. So we'll put a cut here, and when we come back, we'll take a look at the actual German setup that we'll go with. Okay, so here is the principal German setup here for the east. Just very quickly, I'll show you to the west. Again, we have our own defensive line against France. We have a fighter here and a fighter here with just one infantry there, just to kind of, the less other moves I have to make getting these units in back to the west, the better. And I don't think I need that unit to succeed, so I'm just going to set him up there. And you can see my naval bomber is up there, ready to go into the sea if need be. And these fighters are here just to kind of provide a little bit of cover in the odd case that Britain tries to do some sort of strategic bombing, and also just to have units set up over there so I don't have to reposition them later. Just easier that way, and sort of gauging how much to have in the west, how much to have elsewhere. I ended up putting my air transport up here because we will eventually get paratroopers. They're on the production spiral to come in as reinforcements. It's like I'm setting these up again, expecting that whatever I have over here against Poland is enough to defeat Poland, and to do so with pretty decent efficiency. So I don't have the Poles officially set up. I had just set up these units here so that we could talk about them on camera. So what's going to happen is, at the beginning of the game, Germany's going to declare war on Poland. Now, Poland doesn't have a setup on the setup charts. There are special rules, not really special rules, there's standard rules for covering when a minor country has war declared upon it, how to get it set up, and all of that goodness. So the Poles are going to align to the Commonwealth, and they're going to set up in their home country, in their territory. And what is available to set up, it depends on the year it is. So basically, you look at the units, and all of the ground units that are generally all the units that are a year. The back on the back of the counter is a year. If the year on the counter is before the current year, they're going to get that unit. And then any units that have the current year on them are going to come as a reinforcement on the production spiral. And so, as we look at that, you need to sort of be thinking about how much force is going to be necessary to defeat these Polish units. Now, keep in mind, if you're playing with actual opponents, the German player's just going to set up, and unless you've memorized how strong the Poles are, or are looking at your own copy of the game or something, you can't really do what I'm doing here, which is sort of show how strong Poland is, and I'm like looking at the counters and investigating and talking about it in your in-player game, whether or not someone's going to let you do that. I don't know. You guys figure it out, right? So for sure, there's going to be the Dutch, not the Dutch, the Polish fleet, which is going to start here in Danzig. And then you have the air force of the Poles, and then you have the ground forces here. So these ones in this sort of section, this pile, are the ones that are going to be entering the game from the time that the Germans declare war. So what do we have to show for it? Well, we have a 3 air combat ability fighter. We have a very basic bomber with some basic ability. Opposing it are going to be German fighters. I've got a German fighter with 6 combat ability. It's a German fighter with a 5 combat ability. And that is pretty... we're very likely to shoot down that Polish fighter if they engage in combat. So I think that's enough without, without leaving Germany totally undefended in terms of being bombed in the coming months, and turns and everything else. The bomber, I'm not too worried about. It's an okay bomber. It's not as good as most of the other German ones. Unfortunately, when it came time to draw bombers, I didn't get the good Stuka, which is a real bummer. I got one Stuka that's pretty good at tactical bombing. Unfortunately, I didn't get the good one, which is a real bummer. I'll have to build that the old-fashioned way. In terms of actual ground forces, there is an HQ, which we'll probably end up putting in Warsaw or nearby. It has a 2 reorg ability, so it's not a great HQ. Its combat factors are 4, which aren't great either. There are a number of ground units here, so we get 6 other ground units that are all of 1938 or earlier. I'm just going to do a quick double check of that. Yep. 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 And yep. So these all together, in terms of combat ability, we're looking at like 9, 15, 19, 24, not counting the HQ, so 24 combat factors. Now, I'm going to be the Polish player, right? I'm going to be the Allied player. So there's sort of like, how do I defeat myself? Well, the Germans have to set up first themselves. And the way I've structured it is I have infantry here to apply pressure from the north, as well as a bomber just to kind of help in that general area. I have a mech here to come through this way with infantry support. I have one of our armor with motorized. So the idea being I can blitz this way, potentially. Some more infantry here, mountaineer here to kind of come up through the mountains a little bit. An HQ in place, and then another pairing of motorized and armor with, again, the air support here. And the idea is going to be, however the Poles decide to set up, we're going to be looking to make the most effective use of our blitzing ability as possible. And that comes down to the blitz table, the combat tables. You're either rolling on assault or blitz. Assault is usually the default and is the one that a defender is going to pick because it's awfully bloody for the attacker. The blitz table is used when you have more mech or armor than your opponent, and the terrain allows for it, the terrain needing to be either clear, desert, or forest. And that combat chart allows the attacker to take fewer losses. It also forces more retreats than elimination of the enemy, but in a lot of cases, retreats are just fine and dandy here because the retreats are going to be what's going to clear the path to Warsaw, essentially, is really what we need to have happen. Now, why is Warsaw important? Well, this might seem like obvious details to most people, but just in terms of World in Flames rules, minor countries are conquered if an enemy is occupying the capital city during the conquest phase of a turn. So at the end of the turn, the Germans have gotten into Warsaw. The rest of the units, I believe, are going to go poof at that point. And that's really important that we need to get into Warsaw. That's the main thing. And we'll eliminate all the Polish units along the way that we can. Now, there's also additional units here that are going to get to show up and help defend Poland. Some of these are reserves, so they can be called out once they're at war. And they're okay strength. There's a 3 combat factor and a 4 combat factor one here. They'll be able to be placed into cities as long as the stacking allows it. So there's, you're going to look at it and you're not going to want to overstack the cities because you're going to get these 2 free units as the Commonwealth player. And then if we make it past the first turn, we do have a 1939 unit that will enter the game. Again, that's only if we fail to take out Poland in the first turn. And this is a 6-3 white print unit, which is pretty strong. So if we can survive that unit, if we can survive as the Poles, that unit will enter as well. And so you can imagine just looking at the situation and given the combat strengths, the Germans certainly have a lot of advantages to how they're going to get in here, and it's really going to be once we actually start the game, which hasn't happened yet. It is going to be a question of whether or not we can actually, for the Germans, can we take them out in time to be efficient? And for the Poles, it's going to be what can we do to delay the Germans as much as possible from taking Warsaw. And I've kind of seen two different ways to look at it. You can either defend up and defend at the border, or you can form a constrained sort of, layered defensive units. I think historically, if you were trying to look at this from a historical perspective, the Poles defended up front, and that allowed the Germans to kind of surround them and blow past them and kind of bypass them. And in a recent game of World in Flames that I played in person with friends, where I was Germany and my opponent was the Allies, he did a layered defense of Warsaw. And so just to kind of show like what that would look like, so we've got, this guy here, and, a unit, let's say here, and here, 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 and, maybe you do something like this, or maybe something like that, with the idea that, you're going to survive that first impulse, and then you're going to put units into Warsaw or Lodz, and basically, you're just going to hold and hope that the attacks that are conducted are basically you're delaying. The right way to think about this: you're delaying the conquering of Warsaw as much as possible. So you're just putting units around it, and you're forcing the Germans to attack and hope that the attack goes well each time. And that at the last second you can pull in the militia and or the reinforcement if you can last through the whole turn. And basically, Poland that lasts into turn 2 could be looked at as a victory for the Allies. Now, when my opponent, did this, and it maybe not the exact setup, but close, I did knock out Poland in one turn. I cleared it every impulse. I basically eliminated a stack with minimal losses. I think I lost like 1 infantry corps in the whole thing. I rolled decently well and had the right modifiers. And we basically just worked our way. Every impulse was a layer destroyed and closer to Warsaw, a layer destroyed closer to Warsaw. So I'm not going to say for certain that's how we're going to set up the Poles here. We might choose to do something different, but we'll have to decide that and figure out what we want to do. So, for now, I'm just going to take these units. I'm going to set them, aside. Knowing they're not really there yet, the fleet will end up being there. But that, I think, is our German setup now. I'm sure it could be criticized. I'm sure there's other ways to look at doing it. I basically already committed, all of my HQs to fighting here just because I want that benefit to do it quickly. It does mean that, I'll have to move all of these guys back west when it's over, or at least leave some guys behind to hold the border with Russia. So, we'll leave a few guys behind, but we'll otherwise have to pull back west. And, it's going to take some time. Even doing rail moves, we're sort of limited on how many units you can move with rail, and it takes a while for those units to kind of get back into good shape. Or you're moving them, every impulse manually, trudging across Germany, and that takes some time too. So you need to kind of think about that as well. How many units is it going to take to take Warsaw? If I can leave some behind over here after taking out a first crack at the outer layers of defense, there's no point in advancing them. I can just start moving them west. But then, if I roll really bad for combat and I need a new corps to jump into the line, it would hurt if I moved them farther away. So there's just those sort of things you need to figure out how you want to proceed. And I'd say, I have a pretty strong setup here against the Poles. It should go reasonably well. We should be able to pull off pretty decent combats, I'm hoping. But we'll see. The Poles again get to pick their setup at the very last second, at the declare war stage before the Axis actually gets a chance to do anything. So we'll look at that. You'll notice that I did not set up to do an early Denmark invasion. I basically, at least for now, I'm not going to worry about an early invasion yet of them or Norway. The Commonwealth part of my brain is thinking about mining the Norwegian coast, and so we'll look at that when there's actually an opportunity to do so. But for now, we'll focus on Poland. We'll make this a little more straightforward for you guys. I'm playing myself, right? So that's always the tough thing. Like, I can't outsmart myself. I can only try to figure out what is reasonable for one side to do and what is reasonable for the other side. If they assume that maybe the other side, what side A is doing is, we'll figure out what the best thing to do or what's reasonable. Side B has to figure out what's a decent way to defend against side A's potential strategy that they would implement in a real, kind of setting. If you're playing against your buddies, obviously they're going to have their own mind about how they want to proceed and what do they think is good, how much risk do they want to accept in what they're doing. And I warned this when I played the Dark Valley, my big playthrough. I might play conservatively because I'm just playing myself. I can't take a big gamble because I know if I am taking a big gamble, the other part of my brain, the other me, knows that I'm taking that big gamble. So it's going to be weird. Probably you might not see certain actions that in a real game you might see. So just keep that in mind as we go. This might be a very vanilla game of following the grooves of history in terms of Poland, Low Countries and so on. But hopefully this will be an educational experience for those looking to watch the game and learn a thing about World in Flames. Right? That's the whole goal. That's the whole idea here. So we are, I think, at the end of all the setup that we need. Anything else that I've forgotten we'll cover in the next video. I do need to move the fleets out to sea from their starting locations. But, it's not super important that most of them do that. But we can look to set it up here and follow through. So we'll look at that in the next video, and probably the next video we should be able to start actual gameplay. So if you're just here for the setup, you may only need to watch the first few minutes of the next video, because this one's probably getting long as it is. If you want to stick around and watch the actual gameplay and me running through all the turns and talking about strategy and things that are going on, then you're welcome to stick around and watch the series. We'll see how far I get. I intend to play to 45, but that's a very long, that's a big commitment. So we'll have to see how much my mental fortitude keeps me on this track, as there are other games that are worth playing and worth talking about, and this is taking up a lot of table space. We'll see what happens. Anyway, thanks guys for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, keep gaming. Later.